For our final lecture for Unit 1.3, we're going to look at some important major organisms. Now, here I've given you a somewhat detailed version of the geological timescale with a lot more information than you need to memorize. Can be a little overwhelming. Look at the SLO, the Student Learning Outcome for Unit 1.3. There is a cut down version of this with highlighted in red the eras, the dates, and the periods that you need to know, which you'll also see here, but you've got a lot more information. In addition, I've put some of the dates that we talked about here on this one also. So those dates you do need to know also. So this can be a good guideline, but those are in the lecture and they're highlighted there. And so you should learn those dates. We have come up to 540 million years ago. And up to this point, everything has been in the oceans, in the water. Life originates in the oceans. And for the first 500 billion years or so, a little bit more than that, sorry, the first 3 billion years or so of life on Earth, up to a little bit more than 5 billion years ago, we see only organisms living in the oceans, okay? But now we're going to highlight and talk about some of those major milestones in organisms. For these groups, you don't need to know the dates. The only date I'm going to have you learn after 540 million years ago is 250 million years ago, which is the beginning of the Mesozoic, and 65 million years ago, which is the beginning of the Cenozoic. And that's misspelled on this one. It should be an O after the E there. But anyway, so you do need to know those dates. But I'm not going to ask you when did we first see spiders on Earth or when did the trilobites originate. But I have dates listed here just for frame of reference as we go through these, but you don't need to memorize them and spend time on them. So if you know those dates for those first 8 major life events, you know that 250 million years ago we begin the Mesozoic, and 65 million years ago we begin the Cenozoic. Those are all the dates that you need to know. Okay, but the dates are here for your reference. So we're going to start with plants. The first organisms to make the transition from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment were the plants. And this happened somewhere around 500, maybe a little bit more than 500 million years ago. And it was a transition. The earliest terrestrial plants were still very tightly tied to the water, were probably somewhat similar to modern day algae or liverworts or mosses, which can only grow in very damp, moist environments. Now notice also these early plants were very simple. They didn't have complex structures, certainly didn't have flowers, stems, roots, anything like that. So they were fairly simple and very similar to today's modern liverworts and mosses. Okay, but that occurred about 500 million years ago. Now before this, we had lots of photosynthesizing organisms. For billions of years, we had cyanobacteria and their ancestors that were photosynthesizing. We had more complex organisms that were completely aquatic that were also photosynthesizing. So this simply represents a transition to a terrestrial environment. The lycophytes were the first truly terrestrial organisms, and a common name for them is tree ferns. We see them appearing in the fossil record about 400 million years ago, and they have the first simple vascular systems. And a vascular system allows you to move water and nutrients from one part of your body to another. So this was a critical milestone. And these early lycophytes covered vast swaths of the terrestrial landscape. In fact, they probably covered much of that or all of the habitable terrestrial ecosystems. And they became quite large. We do have some modern descendants of these that are still very, very similar to those ancestral lycophytes. And they're called club mosses. But the largest ones were dozens of meters high and it made these vast swamps and forests in the Paleozoic era. Okay, so these were very important. Now there's one other important concept that you need to associate with these lycophytes. During this period of time, they had evolved cellulose and lignin, which are these complex carbohydrates that make up the hard, woody structures that we see in modern plants. But at this time, in these early periods, there were no organisms that could degrade those, that could use them as a food source. They're very rich in carbohydrates, but they're also very hard to digest. So if we eat cellulose today, we don't digest it. It's important for us as fiber, but it goes right through us and doesn't provide energy. But other organisms are able to digest it. And so what happened during these early periods of time is that these lycophytes would die and build up and grow, and we get very small amounts of recycling and degradation occurring. And so they would just build up and build up and build up one on top of one another. And so this left behind these massive carbohydrate-rich deposits that eventually got incorporated into rocks and became coal. And this is the reason we call one of these periods the Carboniferous period, is because it's full of these coal deposits. And that's very important geologically, but also important for our modern society, right? Our modern industrial revolution, and even today, much of our energy comes from burning these deposits that originated as Carboniferous and other eras, but as lycophyte deposits that eventually became compacted and turned into coal. The last major event we're going to look at plants happened 160 million years ago, and that's the origin of the flower. And so this leads to our modern and most diverse group of plants called the angiosperms. So the flower itself developed about 160 million years ago, maybe simpler forms a little bit farther back. It's difficult, but we get all of these dates from fossil evidence. Okay, and modern flowers have become more complex. We still have some remnants of those early simple ones and much more complex ones today. Now, we're going to jump back again to about 500 million years ago, and we're now going to go forward looking at animals and the origin of some types of animals and eventually their transition to a terrestrial environment. Now, realize because animals at some level rely on plants, that we're not going to get terrestrial animals until we have terrestrial plants, until we have a food source on land for them to eat. But early on, during this Cambrian diversion, we get this massive explosion of very, very diverse groups, some of which we can place in modern phyla quite easily, like arthropods, albeit weird arthropods. Others are a little bit more problematic and may have left behind no ancestors, and even some of them look quite alien. Some of them got quite large and were the dominant predators in the food system. So these early Eurypterids, which are sometimes called sea scorpions, and were the ancestors of modern scorpions, but they were entirely aquatic. Some of them got 8, 9, 10 feet long and were the dominant predator of the time. So arthropods are a very important group early on, and we see them originating in this Cambrian explosion. One very important arthropod group that dominated the Paleozoic era are the trilobites. The trilobites are now all completely extinct. They left behind no descendants. So during this mass extinction at the end of the Permian, we lose the trilobites. Another very important arthropod group, and this is now looking at the transitions to terrestrial environments, which happened about 400 million years ago, were the insects. There's some debate about whether insects were the first terrestrial arthropods. Most likely centipedes and their relatives were on land a little bit before, but insects followed closely after. And insects are a very important group, number one, because they are so diverse. There are more species of insects by far than any other group of organisms. There are more species of insects than all other groups of organisms put together. And not only that, but insects have a very tight and important association with flowering plants. So the pollination relationship, the food source, insects use flowering plants as a food source. So the diversity of plants was possible because of the diversity of insects, and vice versa. They really work together to create this vast diversity that we see in both terrestrial plants and in the insects that rely on them and live on them. And some of them got quite large. There's an upper limit to how big insects can get today because they don't have active transport of oxygen. But when there's more oxygen in ancient environments, they could get much larger. And so we have dragonflies that were the size of birds, and some centipedes that got quite massive. But there's a limit to how big they can get today. Another important group of arthropods is spiders. And spiders are ecologically very important. They're the top predators in these smaller niches and are quite important ecologically. So just know spiders come along a little bit later. You don't have to memorize the date. Now, along this time, as we're getting arthropods beginning to invade the land, we still have very important diverse groups in the ocean. So the ammonites are a group of mollusks, and they really left behind no descendants, although they have close relatives that still look somewhat similar. There's some debate as to whether these are descendants of the ammonites or just a closely related group. They look very similar. These are the nautilusts. And then other groups which survived into our modern time are the octopus and squid, which are also closely related. But the ammonites themselves were just so important. They were small, they were medium, they were very, very large, and some fossil deposits are just made up of almost nothing but ammonites. They were so dominant and so important. And as I mentioned, some of them got quite large. The largest ones had a span of 5 or even more feet across for their shells. Okay, so just know what an ammonite is. Look at this spelling and don't confuse it with an amniote, which unfortunately is very closely spelled. But amniota is a group of vertebrates. But the ammonites are these mollusks that were very, very important throughout the Paleozoic and into the Mesozoic era. Now, the rest of the groups we're going to look at are chordates. And chordates eventually lead to the vertebrates, which include lampreys, sharks' rays, and skates, different types of fish, and then, of course, our modern tetrapod vertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. So this is a group of vertebrate phylogeny and showing you some of the extinct groups and also the living ones today. In fact, this includes chordates also, which are the lancet and the hagfish, other things which are not true vertebrates but are chordates. So just be aware of this. You can use this for a review. We're going to talk about most of these major groups. Some are not as important. We'll skip over a little bit. So the very first primitive chordates we see during the Cambrian explosion, maybe just a little bit before that. Most of them were very soft-bodied. They had hard teeth, and so their teeth preserved well, and this is a selection of some of the teeth. So we know they were very diverse. There were many species. Sometimes fossil deposits are full of these teeth. And the name of the group, the conodonts, comes from these teeth. Some we have only speculation about how they look, but this is an artist's interpretation. They may or may not have had complex eyes, but they certainly had other early chordate features. So just know the group conodonts. They were the earliest vertebrates, and they appear around the time of this Cambrian explosion. And they were very important, but they didn't leave behind any direct descendants. Now, the modern-day lancet or Amphioxus is closely related. There, again, there's a lot of debate as to whether they're direct descendants of these conodonts or just a closely related branch. But we don't have any true conodonts left with us today. The lamprey is also closely related. The lamprey and hagfish are two chordate groups that are closely related. Now, the lamprey technically is in the craniata group, the vertebrate group, or at least closely related. But just know that these are some of the early steps, and there are still some living lineages that are at least closely related to these earliest of the chordates. But the true vertebrates don't come around until a little bit later, but still at this Cambrian explosion time. And these true vertebrates have a cartilaginous backbone, later a bony backbone, but they also have other bony elements. So that even though they don't have a true backbone yet at this early stage, they do have other bone formations that help to protect them. The earliest ones we call ostracoderms, and there's a variety, a diversity of these, but most of them were fairly small, maybe getting a few feet long at the longest. And we call these ostracoderms vertebrates, even though they don't have a true bone, a backbone made out of bone, because they show the early cartilaginous version of that backbone. In addition, they had bony plates, and there's some debate as to why they had these bony plates on their head, on their head region. Whether it was defense, we don't know because we don't have good evidence of much larger, although perhaps maybe those eurypterids, those sea scorpions, may have been preying on these, and so these bony structures may be a defense against that. But we even see the bony structures much before we see the large arthropod predators. So ostracoderms, all extinct today. We didn't leave behind any descendants of them, but they did very well for a time. The next major group are the placoderms, and these are important, and we include them because they are the first jawed vertebrates. So the jaw was a major innovation that allowed for diversification of the vertebrates. And of course, the jaw allows you to do many things: hunt in different ways, protect yourself, move about, organize your head in different ways you can't do it before you had jaws. Some of these placoderms got quite large. The dominant predators of the time, killer whale sized, were placoderms. And these are the jawed vertebrates, still mainly cartilaginous in the skeleton, but with many bony elements, including quite complex teeth in their jaws. Most of them were much smaller, and they were a diverse, important group. Began about 450 million years ago, present through much of the Paleozoic, but are now extinct. So we don't have any living placoderms. The next major group that we're going to look at are the chondriichthyes. These are the cartilaginous sharks, the skates, the rays. Those are all part of this same group. And they are a very diverse group anciently and are still diverse today and have some many successful descendants living today, right? So the sharks, the rays, the chimera, which you may not be familiar with, but are still around today. So just know they originated quite anciently, did very, very well, and are still around, but maybe not as successful as they were once during the Paleozoic era. The next major group we're going to talk about are the bony fish, or the Actinopterygii. I'll use in exams both words. I'll use bony fish and then in parentheses the technical scientific term Actinopterygii. And these are the most diverse and most successful fish today, right? So this includes your little goldfish. It includes all bony fish, including, this is a mola, I want to say. Anyway, a large ocean sunfish. And all other sunfish, very, very diverse, thousands of species, diversity in marine and freshwater environments. So just know the group, know approximately when they originated. I don't care that you memorize the date here, but you should know the relative order. So we saw first in the fossil record these conodonts, right? Then we see the ostracoderms. The placoderms appear, even though we've got the dates there that you don't need to memorize, you should know they occurred after. And then we see the chondrichthyes in the fossil record, and then most recently for the ones that we've talked about so far, we see the Actinopterygii. At this time, we also see another group of fish that we call the Sarcopterygii, and the common name for these are the lobed fin fish. And these appear after the bony fish, and they were not typically terribly important or diverse as fish. However, we are going to include them, and you need to know them. Number one, because there are a couple of modern relatives, descendants, including the lungfish and the coelacanth, which was thought to be extinct for many years, but was discovered swimming around in the Indian Ocean in the 1950s, and there are several species still around today. So they're important because they survived, they're still around, but they're not very diverse and don't play a big role and major role in most ecosystems. However, the second reason they're important is because these early Sarcopterygii, some of them evolved and became tetrapod vertebrates. And so the first tetrapod vertebrates to make their way onto land, which is why they evolved these four legs, were the amphibians. Now notice the reason we call these tetrapods, which means four-legged, is because the earliest versions had modified fins for support, and they had both forefins and hind fins. Now if we look back at, I'm going to go back a little bit, we look at the Sarcopterygii, the lobed finfish, they also have four fins. They didn't use them for supporting themselves, but they used them for swimming. They have forefins and they have pelvic fins. You can see the forefin right there, which all fish have these pectoral fins, but we also have pelvic fins that other fish don't have. And so those eventually evolved and became these legs in the early amphibians. And we see the amphibians appearing first about 375 million years ago. There are still many amphibians today. They're still somewhat successful, although probably more successful in the past. Everything from modified frogs with jumping legs to still quite large, maybe as large as some of the ancient ancestors, but some of these got even bigger. But this is a large salamander from Asia. So amphibians, know that they are part of the tetrapod vertebrate group. Also included in the tetrapod vertebrate group are the amniotes. So these are tetrapod vertebrates, but it's an important subcategory. And the amniotes, not to be confused with the ammonites, right, which are those mollusks, but the amniotes are named after the amniotic membrane. And this was the thing that allowed them to become really fully terrestrial. So although amphibians, many of them are terrestrial, they live their entire life cycle on land, they still require water for their eggs, or at least a very, very wet place, because the eggs will shrivel up and die if they are not either submerged in water or in a place with about 100% humidity. However, the amniotic layer allowed for truly terrestrial eggs. And so whether it's an amniotic membrane enclosing you in your egg or an amniotic sac like we have in the mammals, that allows for a terrestrial environment and a terrestrial lifestyle. There are three major groups of amniotes. Excuse me. These three major groups of amniotes that you need to know. The Euryapsids I put in parentheses because there's some debate about them, but most people include them under the Diapsids, and we won't worry about them. But you need to know anapsids, synapsids, and diapsids. The names come from the organization of the skull. So the anapsids, pictured here, have no opening behind the orbital opening for the eye. So the eye is here, and then notice that all the bones are fused. There are no openings. That's why they're called anapsids. The synapsids are so named because they kind of have this fused opening behind the eye. So this is the orbit for the eye. That's the nasal opening there, the orbital for the eye. And then they have kind of this fused opening, and so that's why we call them synapsids. The diapsids have two distinct openings. Notice they occur in different places as opposed to these two openings here. So diapsids, as the name implies, have two openings behind the orbit for the eye. There's the nasal opening again. You don't need to memorize this. I'm not going to give you a skull and say, is it an anapsid or a diapsid? But if that helps you remember it, great. So let's talk in detail about these three groups of tetrapod vertebrates, these amniotes. So you should recognize they are vertebrates, they're tetrapod vertebrates, they're amniotes, and then within that we have these three classes. The first, which were dominant early on, were the anapsids. And the anapsids, you look at them, and there's kind of this interesting thing you look at and say, oh, it's a dinosaur. Now, technically, that's not correct. These are not dinosaurs, and we'll get to dinosaurs here in a little bit, but these are anapsids. And so the term dinosaur, if you just use it as a big, scaly terrestrial amniote, that's what many people use it for, but that's not the correct usage of the term dinosaur. And we're going to use it as its correct taxonomic designation for this class, okay? So the anapsids were diverse. Some were small, some were large, up to hippo cow size. They did very, very well for a little while. But eventually, the other amniotes, the synapsids and the diapsids, begin to compete against them, and eventually the anapsids go extinct. There are no living anapsids. Now, some older textbooks, there's still a little bit of debate about this, but most people agree that the turtles, despite not having an opening behind their orbit, are really truly diapsids. They're part of the diapsid group. They just have secondarily lost the openings in their skull. So although turtles were once included in anapsids and thought to be a living descendant, now we recognize that they are not. So anapsids are now extinct. So that gets us to our second amniote group, the synapsids. And again, synapsids came a little bit after the anapsids, and they do very, very well for a time, and they're somewhat diverse. Eventually, they begin to lose in competition to the diapsids, and so they become less and less important. However, about 65 million years ago, there was a major extinction event, and we'll look at that in a later chapter. But that major extinction event led to a few of the synapsids being able to now fill up ecological niches that had been vacated by the extinction of the diapsids. And we'll talk about diapsids in more detail. But synapsids, although they were large, diverse, you look at this guy, and again, you look at this one and you say, oh, dinosaur. You can sometimes even buy those little toy dinosaur sets with these guys in them. But they are not dinosaurs. They are amniotes, but they're part of the synapsid group, which is separate from dinosaurs. Okay, so Dimetrodon here, not a dinosaur. Eventually, the living remnants after that major extinction event 65 million years ago continue to change and evolve and become the ancestors of our modern mammals. So mammals are the descendants of the synapsid group. Originally looked large and scaly, maybe even quote-unquote dinosaur-like, but we're not dinosaurs. And they evolve and change. They get hairs. They evolve internal reproduction, and of course the mammary glands and all the things that we classify as modern mammals. So know that the living descendants of synapsids are mammals, and they are very, very successful today, but maybe much more so, and would not be as successful if they didn't have the extinction events that occurred at the end of the Mesozoic era. Okay, so the final amniote group that you need to know is the diapsids. And these diapsids dominated throughout the late Paleozoic and all through the Mesozoic era, and they're still very important today. So we're going to talk about them in quite a bit of detail, and you need to know the different groups, some of which are extinct and some of which still have living representatives. They're extant. That's the opposite of extinct. And so we'll highlight these groups and then tell you whether they're extinct or extant. You need to know all of them. You don't need to memorize the dates for them. Just know generally these groups. So one major group of amniotes are of diapsids are the ichthyosaurs. The name means lizard fish, technically, or scaly fish. The ichthyosaurs were a group of diapsids. You could even call them reptiles, although that term is not really a very good taxonomic term. We'll talk about why in a little bit. But This was a major important group. They filled the same niche that modern day whales and dolphins, some other large fish, fill. They were very active, visual predators. But were still egg laying, and there were the diverse forms of them. Some of them look much more dolphin-like than others. But notice they still have all four limbs, four fins and hind fins. So the ichthyosaurs dominate throughout the Mesozoic, but they go extinct at the end of the Mesozoic era with that major meteorite impact. They're extinct and gone, and so we don't have any living ichthyosaurs. The next major group are the plesiosaurs, also a group of diapsids, again, dominant, important throughout. These were some of the largest predators in their environments, but they go extinct, again, barring some major discovery at Loch Ness. Some people think that there's an organism, the Loch Ness monster, living there that may be a remnant plesiosaur, but that's very, very unlikely. So the plesiosaurs, at least as far as all evidence we have, are now completely extinct. The next major, now notice these are all marine, right? So these are really important marine groups, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, and then the lepidosaurs, which were also very important marine groups. If you look at the trailer for the first Jurassic World movie, you see this massive organism coming up out of the water in a stadium full of people, and it is eating a huge shark, right? That is a type of a lepidosaur, sometimes called a mosasaur. And they got very, very big. So there's a human just for comparison. So these are small whale sized, right? Not quite as big as the big baleen whales we have today, but still very, very large and dominant predators. But there were other lepidosaur groups that were terrestrial. And those left behind descendants, the tuatara, which looks like a lizard but is a separate group, and then snakes and lizards, right? So there are still living lepidosaurs, although the big marine forms are extinct. Some of the lepidosaurs are still around today and are ecologically important as snakes and lizards. Okay, the next major diapsid group we're going to talk about are the archosaurs. And so we've gone through the group. We've started with ichthyosaurs, we did plesiosaurs, we've done now lepidosaurs, and then the fourth major group we're going to do are the archosaurs. And we're going to subdivide the archosaurs because there are three major groups within the archosaurs that you need to know about. The first one are the pterosaurs. And the pterosaurs are now completely extinct, but they were very diverse and dominated the flying environments. Insects were the very first organisms to fly, but pterosaurs were the first vertebrates to gain the ability to fly. Some of them were incredibly large, giraffe-sized, and they could fly. Sorry about that, I lost my audio feed. But so these large pterosaurs could fly, so they were incredibly large. Now, just a quick word, there were also small ones, medium ones, everything in between. And when you see an artist's interpretation of color like this, shape is a little easier, but color is often just speculation. And so we don't know for sure if these bright colors were there, but it's reasonable and very well could have been. But there's often a degree of interpretation. The next diapsid group that you need to know are the crocodilians. Archosaur group. They're also within the diapsids, but the archosaur group are the crocodilians. And the crocodilians, of course, include alligators, gharials, caimans, all of our modern crocodilians. There were many extinct ones like this big, scary, quite fast crocodile. But they're still around. They're still important in ecosystems, and they're part of this archosaur group. The last archosaur group we're going to talk about are the dinosaurs, and you are probably already very familiar with these. We have the long-necked sauropod dinosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, the theropod dinosaurs, which include Velociraptor and Tyrannosaurus rex. A very large and diverse group. 65 million years ago, there was a meteorite impact that caused massive extinctions. And we've already talked about how the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, those big lepidosaurs, the pterosaurs, they all went extinct at that time. Dinosaurs were also very greatly impacted by that meteorite event. However, they did not go extinct. That is a common misconception. Dinosaurs, in fact, are still alive today. So in this diagram, you've got a little person there. You know, of course, these big dinosaurs did not live contemporaneously with people. The person is just there for a comparison of size. However, you are now living in a world that is full of dinosaurs. You're like, what? What are you talking about? Birds are a group of dinosaurs. I'm going to say that again. birds are dinosaurs. Now, when we use the word dinosaur, we're using the taxonomic technical definition, and everything that is included in that group needs to be called a dinosaur. So birds are just one of many diverse lineages of dinosaurs. They're more closely related to theropod dinosaurs like Velociraptor and T-Rex than they are to the other dinosaurs, but they're part of that group. So at the end of the Cretaceous era, when this meteorite hits and causes the extinction of many big, large diapsids, most of the dinosaurs go extinct, but the small feathered ones survive. Many other dinosaurs had feathers also. We'll talk about that in Unit 1.4. Okay, but I'm going to say it again. Birds are dinosaurs. So if we review this, and you might very well see a question on the test like this, it doesn't mean to trick you, but it's for some people difficult. If you see a picture or a representation of an anapsid, not a dinosaur, right? If you see a picture of Dimetrodon here, not a dinosaur, it's a synapsid, it's part of that large amniote group, but not a dinosaur, right? Ichthyosaurs, not dinosaurs. All these guys, pterosaurs, right? These are not dinosaurs, although the pterosaurs are more closely related because they're part of the archosaur group. It's not until we get to these final ones. These are dinosaurs, a bird, any bird, right? From a hummingbird to a penguin to a parrot. Those are all remnants, living descendants and part of the dinosaur group. And we'll look at that in some more detail in Unit 1.4.